It's a digital writing assistant that you can download as a browser extension. It is
Introducing career services for life. When they told me my work wasn't essential.
So if you're like me, then horror may seem a little stale as of lately. By and large, it seems that studios are just trying to get numbers up and are repeating tried old tropes. But if you're also like me, then I think I may have a solution. Internet horror allows for a lot more creativity and a lot more independence when it comes to how a work is portrayed. But that's a catch-22 because it can be a mixed bag. Some can be fantastic and others not worth your time. So let me point you in the direction of one of the former, Gemini Home Entertainment. Gemini Home Entertainment is a YouTube channel that currently consists of 15 episodes. The creator of the series, Remy Abode, has done a fantastic job at creating a true analog horror. For those that don't know, analog horror is similar to projects such as Local 58 that managed to inject a horror system inside of the confines of an analog setting. In other words, if you think of old TV broadcast stations and how those can be used for horror elements, along those lines. Not only from a horror perspective, but Remy is incredibly talented at telling a subversive story behind the scenes through these incredible 3D models that he creates himself. Today I'm going to be going through the main plot of Gemini Home Entertainment and analyzing what the story might be. However, I highly encourage you, if this seems interesting at all, that you check out the original channel, which I've linked in the description, as it is criminally underrated, and also check out Remy's Patreon, which I've also linked, because Gemini Home Entertainment itself is not monetized, and this guy deserves the support. Also, if this is interesting to you, I did a video on another analog horror series, Local 58, early on in my channel, which will also be linked below. I also want to give a massive thank you. So I love researching and recording videos like this, but I hate editing them. So a massive thank you to Caitlin, who is editing this currently, for being a huge hand and letting me do stuff like this without hating half of the process. So her Twitter is going to be linked below if you all enjoy the way that this link is in the description. Thank you so much to Rich for sponsoring this video, and thank you all for watching. The first episode is known as World's Weirdest Animals. It starts off as a standard nature documentary in rural Minnesota and focuses on different specific counties, showing prairie chickens and burrowing owls, and everything seems fine until it flips and says we are now looking at something that is everywhere across North America, and it's specifically a creature known as wood crawlers. Now, as far as specifics of everything that I'm going to talk about, at the end, I'm going to go back and analyze and try to put the pieces together, but for now, I'm just laying out the puzzle. It says that the wood crawlers are expert hunters and they nest in the home of large families. This is because, as the video says, it allows them to adapt easier, along with the comforting message that you will hear screaming they stole their voices. It also says to burn the bodies lest they stand up again. So we've established that whatever this wood crawler is, it infests the homes of families as a means to adapt. We then receive footage of something called Nature's Mockery. For now, to make it easier in the future, Nature's Mockery and wood crawlers are synonymous. We then flip over to outside of the house, where it seems from found footage we are watching someone approach a house that has just been infested with wood crawlers. After watching these things that look like people stand still and sort of float across the ground, we're then greeted with the title showing that they are, quote, fake people. We then see one of them off to the side moving their jaw in a title showing that they are, quote, fake people. We then see one of them around these things that someone approach a house that has just been infested with wood crawlers. After watching these things that look like people stand still and sort of float across the ground, we're then greeted with the title showing that they are, quote, fake people. We then see one of them off to the side moving their jaw in a very odd manner, as if they're trying to figure out how the movement works. This is before our cameraman is seen and chased away, ending the first film. As I mentioned, a lot of this may seem confusing at first, but hopefully as I go through explaining these, some of it starts to make more sense. Our second video is called Storm Safety Tips, and it's brought to us by someone known as Harbinge Technologies. This is our first mention of a specific company or entity making one of these videos. That will become more important as they go along, but just keep in mind that whenever I mention who makes one of these videos, just to hold on to it. Storm Safety Tips, similar to World's Weirdest Animals, seems to begin as a simple infomercial. This one is to instruct families on how to prepare for a storm. While it seems normal at first, it then tells you to prepare a structure that is a 10 by 18 foot room with a 4 to 5 foot hemisphere in the middle of the room. Not only that, but to then place a radio by the sphere itself. The messages then become even more odd, as it says to only turn on the radio in case of an emergency. It then says, in the event of the storm, quietly go to the bunker. Your home does not belong to you now. Immediately we see a difference here that this is not related to any ordinary storm. But as was mentioned in World's Weirdest Animals and will be mentioned later, flip the word storm with swarm and this starts to make more sense. It then says that whatever you hear through the radio is a hallucination and that your tears are filled with salt, which is concerning. It says after the storm is past, listen for movement inside. We then get the very curious message of look to the field, do you see the lights, return to your bunker. We're then greeted by footage of lights in the middle of the field before the message then switch and tells us to listen under your feet. This is implying that whatever swarm has infected the house is still there. We then finally get the image of a speaker or something that appears to be a speaker on top of a tower before the video ends. So Harbinge Technologies, whatever this entity is trying to inform us what to do if a storm or swarm attacks. We then start to figure out more of what's going on in our third video, The Deep Blue. This one's done by Geneva Production Company and seems to be a documentary about the ocean. As usual, everything seems normal at first, even though several of the facts mentioned are not correct, until we get to the Marianas Trench. We then see a fictional tunnel off to the side of the Marianas Trench known as the Demesia Tunnel, whose depth is unknown. We're then greeted by the image of this tentacle eye thing at the bottom of the ocean before transmission is cut off. This Demesia Tunnel implies that whatever's affecting us comes from somewhere very deep within the earth, and perhaps the culprit responsible is this squid-looking thing with a giant glowing eye. Not only that, but the light we see on top of the squid is incredibly familiar with the light seen in the field at the end of Storm Safety Tips. So whatever this thing is at the bottom of the ocean, it seems that several of them have come out of the ocean and are now the danger that we have to be afraid of. In our fourth video, known as Artificial Computer Learning,
this is Peacock. Peacock, baby! It's streaming, and it's free. E.T. free. Downton Abbey, we made it free.
we see a program from Regnad Computing. Regnad is demonstrating the capabilities of their AI program. This is done by showing generational learning, or in other words, every iteration of a computer's processing gets better as it learns as time goes on. This is demonstrated by telling the computer to write a short children's storybook to which every iteration will become more clear. It's during this time that we're introduced to two very important names that will come up later, which is Jack and Mary. The first iteration seems simple enough, where it talks about Jack and Mary running and looking for a secret place. And then in Gen 2, it starts to get weird, where the last line of the story is, "I hear you." We then get some more important details in Generation 3, where it says that Mary went down the river that Jack went over, and that the river does not flow with water. And then with Gen 4, we get a very foreboding message about Jack that says, "Jack heard again, voice from space, I have become something else." And then finally, with our final iteration, It says, "Listen to the silver box, stars moving, the hungry eye, here I am." And we then receive an image of the tentacle eye thing shown in the deep blue. So for one, we have a name for this tentacle eye thing, which it's referred to as the hungry eye. Also, the details we get in the children's storybook are interesting. We're going to see later here that this is not a children's storybook at all, and instead an actual entity telling us these things. But what we get from the story mentioned is that Jack managed to get away and Mary did not. We then see that Jack heard a voice from space in some regard and became something else. In our final message, it says, "Listen to the silver box." The only reference to something similar to a silver box that we've gotten so far is that of the radio mentioned in Storm Safety Tips. So this is conflicting information because in Storm Safety Tips it said do not listen to the radio, and now we're here to do listen to the radio. But at the end of that same stanza, the hungry eye says, "Here I am," implying that it is the hungry eye speaking. So best to probably listen to the eye tentacle thing. The story itself becomes more comprehensible with the 4th iteration of our solar system. Again, as the others, it opens up like a normal info show before it gets to Earth. It says Earth is one of the only planets in the solar system to contain life. And then when it gets to Saturn, it says that the rings of Saturn are created. It then gets really weird whenever we get to the planet Neptune, and it says that Neptune is the lens and has been mutated. We then see the iris appear. It then says that the iris is with us now, laughing at us, before saying, "Behold," as the iris itself begins to move on camera. We then see a shot of a sort of laser or light from Neptune, leaving Neptune and going through the solar system towards Earth. Now, while I can't be sure if this thing, the iris, is Neptune after it's been mutated, or if it's a new entity itself, I believe it's a new entity itself, as it says the iris is now with us, as if it came from somewhere else. What it seems happened is whenever this iris appeared, it attacked Neptune first. As it said, Neptune's been mutated. And then whatever happened to Neptune is now happening on Earth. In the 6th episode, Camp Information video, we find out about something known as Moonlight Acres Family Camp. During the activities section where it talks about everything to do with this camp, it mentions something known as the harvest. In the description, it says that the harvest is the lights in the sky event it's known for. These lights, once again, are very similar to that of the hungry eye, which was seen in Storm Safety Tips. When talking about the cabins and accommodations at Moonlight Acres, it says that they are burrow-free, which is the burrow that was mentioned in World's Weirdest Animals. In other words, whatever these woodcrawler things are advertised as not being in the camp. When talking about safety equipment, we see the same tower that was shown in Storm Safety once again. The only true sign of warning we see is to not answer the knock at the door. When talking about the mythos and legends of the camp, it says that in 1935, well-dressed men appeared to the camp and every night would visit the counselor's cabin. It says that eventually a deal was made and the men no longer came around. It then talks about legends of skinwalkers that appeared around the camp. We then see another visual of the hungry eye before we then move into a category called vessels. It shows different people who worked at the camp and how each of them were a vassal because they, quote, answered the door, before finally cutting to another image of the hungry eye and saying that it is what asked to enter. The episode then ends when the door that has been knocked at is opened. So what all did we see in that one? Well, for one, we see the mention of skinwalkers, which in traditional legend is a creature that can transform itself to look like a human. These skinwalkers are mentioned immediately after it says strange men used to visit the counselor's cabin. So because of this, we can infer that it was skinwalkers that were approaching the camp counselor. Now, where else in this story have we seen a legend of things that look like people? That would be the fake people or wood crawlers that were mentioned in the first episode. So these wood crawlers or skinwalkers came to the camp counselor and eventually struck a deal and no longer bothered them. So, while keeping that in mind, remember that this camp advertises their harvest or light in the sky event. Not only that, but at the end, whenever we figure out that the hungry eye is the thing that knocked at the door, or these skin crawlers disguised as humans, that the vessels open the door, or in other words, people that later became the mobiles for these creatures. It'll get more specific as these videos go on, but for now, we can see that whatever these things are and however they're taking over the Earth, it's been happening for a very long time, since at least 1935. Our next episode is titled Lethal Omen Commercial. This is for a video game created by Regnad Computing, the same people who did the artificial intelligence episode. It advertises in the game that you fight enemies in what appears to be the Moonlight Acres family camp. This is confirmed whenever a newspaper on the ground talks about how the up-and-coming Light in the Sky event has been cancelled. Not only that, but next to the main office we can see a safety tower that was again mentioned in the storm safety tips. The game seems to be going normally until near the end the player comes across a sort of flesh or amalgamation of plants with what appears to be a person inside of it. Shortly afterwards, a new enemy appears, slowly lumbering and moving in janky motions towards the player, which cannot be killed. Running away, the player comes across a bunker, and after going inside, we see it's the exact bunker from Storm Safety due to the dimensions of the room, the hemisphere in the middle, and the radio next to the hemisphere. As the player is standing there, a wood crawler begins to burst in before it then cuts to the middle of the night in the camp. The player turns around, sees the iris shown in our solar system before cutting out and ending the episode. So we see that Regnad Computing is at least knowledgeable enough about what's happening at Moonlight Acres to make this game around it. And aside from the previous mentioned references to past episodes, such as the sort of speaker tower and the bunker, we see new things shown, such as the slowly lumbering creature and the plant thing with a person inside of it. Also, this is really cool. You can actually play Lethal Omen. As a matter of fact, I did so on a live stream, which was my first live stream on this channel. If you go to the Lethal Omen episode of Gemini Home Entertainment, it's linked in the description. You can play it. There's multiple endings. It's really cool. I'm not going to link it here below because that means you have to go to the original video to get it, so this guy can get more traffic because, once again, he deserves it. The next episode is Jack Wilder's Wilderness Survival Guide. As is common with these things at this point, everything seems fine, talking about survival gear until talking about how to deal with wild animals, and we get to the bear. As the person walks away, we see the bear transform into something else. Then in the plant life section, we see something called Nature's Mockery. Now this is twofold, as Nature's Mockery is what the wood crawler was described as in World's Weirdest Animals, and the image that we're seeing on screen is very similar to the plant thing seen in Lethal Omen. It says that if contact is made with Nature's Mockery, the person will receive hallucinations, sudden muscular paralysis, body disfigurement, and flesh decay. Then in the next section, when it talks about sounds to avoid, one of the ones that is said to be avoid is screaming, and it's described as auditory hallucinations. Keep in mind, auditory hallucinations is the same thing that Storm Safety Tips said would come out of the radio. We're then given instructions on how to make a fire before it says, if the fire fails, follow the lights. Which, as we've talked about, given the hungry eye and all, lights at this point are not a good thing. We then switch back to a handheld camera. We then hear screaming before the camera gets to a man in a field, who it seems that that's where the screams are coming from, but he's just standing there. As a matter of fact, this person moves very similarly to the fake people seen in World's Weirdest Animals. And to top it off, the way that this thing is moving is similar to the unkillable enemy in Lethal Omen. It then talks about if any scratches are obtained while out to rip the foreign object from body, which will be something that applies in a minute, before we get a final shot of this quote-unquote person in a window, standing very similarly to the way that these fake people stood in the first episode. So this Wilderness Survival Guide is trying to teach people how to stay away from these creatures, both Nature's Mockery and whatever these skinwalker things are. So much so that it says if you hear screaming, it's just a hallucination and don't go towards it. Although he seems to break his own rules when it says if the fire fails, follow the light. So perhaps whoever made this was starting to give in to the hallucinations themselves. Also, keep in mind the name of the person who made this, Jack Wilder. The other time that we've heard Jack mentioned was in the artificial intelligence episode. So given the story that was mentioned in that one, it says Jack tried to get away, as Mary could not, before becoming something else. Our next episode, titled Sleep Image Visualizer, is given to us by Harbinge Technologies, the same people who did the storm safety tips. In it, we see a device that seems to be exactly what it says, a sleep image visualizer, or in other words, it can allow your dreams to be seen while you're awake. It describes the way to work the system as placing what appears to be headphones around an aluminum dome. This would be the same aluminum dome that was shown in storm safety tips. We then get some examples of what images the sleep image visualizer can create, such as Levi Jacobs, who was asleep for 6 minutes and received this incredibly comforting image of a face peering around a doorway. Our next is Adrian Gordons, who was asleep for 4 minutes and saw what appears to be an observatory. This makes sense given the connections to a potential alien takeover. And then our last two are more interesting, where we then get Jack Dean. Now, in a community post made by Gemini Home Entertainment, we see a missing person image of a Jack Wilder Dean. This means that this Jack mentioned now, Jack Dean, is the same Jack Wilder who made the wilderness survival video, as well as the Jack mentioned in the artificial intelligence video. Jack was asleep for 3 days and he saw a man by his bed, sitting there simply watching him. We then get our final person with Joseph Allen, who it says never woke up, and his image was that of a giant dark mass rising up over the horizon. Now, not to get too distracted on that last point, but remember how I said you can play the Lethal Omen game yourself? Well, one of the 4 endings that you can get in that game is of this image of a giant dark thing rising up over the horizon. Keep in mind, in the Lethal Omen video seen on the channel, the ending is the iris appearing in the sky. For that reason, I believe this giant dark mass is the iris which was shown in our solar system, or in other words, the source of all of this. Also, the fact that Joseph never woke up is probably not great. Neither is Jack being asleep for 3 days, but I'll talk about what happened to him at the end. Our next episode is called Games for Kids, brought by Optica Video. It starts fairly normal, showing several different games that kids can play with friends. While this may be looking a little too deep, I think it should be mentioned that all of the games mentioned feature an it character, or in other words, one kid being chased by other kids or vice versa. Regardless, it seems pretty normal until we get to a game called Feed the Woods. In Feed the Woods, it tells the children to wait for their parents to fall asleep before gathering their friends and walking into the woods until they don't see the lights, before screaming at the top of their lungs. In the previous games mentioned, it would use a red arrow to show where the kids would be while the game was going on. Now we see a red arrow pointing into the darkness and showing us sad faces. The implication being that these scared children are now out there in the dark. We then get another image of Hungry Eye itself, before we see a cop car that is pulled underground by one of these arms from either the Hungry Eye or a wood crawler. It says the game is over when, quote, the forest is fed. It then ends on the positive note where it shows an arrow pointing at Earth and says, found you. So we see here that this marketing that is supposed to be aimed at children to show them fun games to play tells them to run into the middle of the woods at night and scream. And then the game is over when the forest is fed. My theory here is similar to the theory that Inside a Mind has. Remember back in the camp video how it says that these men would approach the camp counselor every night until a deal was made and it didn't bother them anymore? Well, it seems like the deal that was made was that instead of attacking the adults, that these creatures would instead take the children. That would explain why this video is being produced, to tell children to do this very risky behavior. Even the visual of the cop car being pulled underground implies that perhaps the police were looking for these missing kids before they themselves were made victims. Also, the underground thing's going to be important in a second, but wait on that for now. And of course, the ending where it shows a giant red arrow pointing at Earth saying found you is talking about these aliens that are coming to Earth in order to find us. In our next video, Advanced Mining Vehicle, we see NAMAD Technologies, who have made an underground rover to explore cave systems. Again, everything's normal at first before it says that there is a microphone placed on the rover to hear nests. We then start to see these weird sort of red roots that seem to be hanging from the rocks of the cave itself. We then see the message that blood pumps through the garden's veins and the crops mature. This is another mention of whatever this entity is being referred to as a sort of plant, similar to nature's mockery in wilderness survival. The rover then gets a view of a hungry eye that seems to attack it as the rover sinks to incredible depths before we lose transmission. So keep a few things in mind. Way back in the ocean video, we saw that whatever these things are, they're associated with this super deep tunnel at the bottom of the ocean. Not only that, but we've had several mentions that these things seem to burrow underground. So whatever these things are, they exist underground in caves. These back to view of a hungry eye that seems to attack it as the rover sinks to incredible depths before we lose transmission. So keep a few things in mind. Way back in the ocean video, we saw that whatever these things are, they're associated with this super deep tunnel at the bottom of the ocean. Not only that, but we've had several mentions that these things seem to burrow underground. So whatever these things are, they exist underground in cave systems and are cultivating a sort of nest, as they're called, or these roots to go up above ground. These roots could result in creatures such as nature's mockery. And as it mentions that blood flows through the garden veins, maybe people aren't just being used as vessels for these skinwalkers or wood crawlers, but are also being used as food for these plants. And the hungry eye itself is used to either guard or cultivate these roots. To add weight to that theory, the creator Remy Abode refers to this hungry eye creature as the gardeners. We then get more details about that in our next video, Deep Root Disease. It starts out with the belief that we are referring to a disease that involves plants.
Experience matters. For over 145 years, more families trust ADT for
Hence the title, Deep Root Disease. Until when describing what the disease does, it says that the roots try to make contact with bone. And when showing how the disease seems to take over, we get an image or short video of a person sleeping. It talks about the symptoms being sores, sprouting of more roots from the person, muscle spasms. And when it says trying to figure out if someone has deep root disease, one of the things to look for is unrecognizable smells in their home. On top of that, it says that if someone's infected by it, they may stop dreaming, until it eventually says that the person becomes something else. So this deep root disease, which can be associated with the root seen in the mining video, seems to infect people, dig down into their bone, and infect their system until they become something else. Now, the line about looking for strange smells in the home tells me that this directly comes from nests or burrows made in people's houses. So it seems that the way the life cycle for these creatures work is the hungry eyes create these roots that infect people and either turn them into nature's mockery or wood crawlers, or perhaps both, before the wood crawlers then burrow beneath people's houses, catch more people whose bodies they use as vessels and whose blood they use as fuel for their garden so that they can create more. This sort of slow, methodic building of essentially an army would explain why these things have been in motion, as the Moonlight Acres video mentioned, since 1935. Our next video, called Monthly Progress Report, is a report from Regnad Computing. This is a specific look at the AI that was mentioned in both Lethal Omen and the AI video. It says that the AI was created for failure prevention and computer processing. As a matter of fact, it says that Lethal Omen was created as a means to show the graphical advancements that their computing power is now capable of. When talking about the Artificial Computer Learning System, or ACL, that they built, we then get a mention of their client. It says that their client spearheaded their AI technology and allowed them to become as powerful as they currently are. We then learn that we are going to see direct contact made from Regnad to their client themselves. We're then shown computers which seem to be covered in these sort of roots that are the same roots shown in Deep Root Disease and Advanced Mining Vehicle. So obviously Regnad is infected to some capacity. Regnad gives a prompt to which their client responds. We're then shown an antenna array before we see a view of what the client is, as it appears to be a giant glowing light in space. Either a hungry eye, or most likely the iris itself, the source of all of this. Regnad gives the prompt Earth, to which the client responds, "Mary sees the gateway die. Sleeping ones are eaten whole. The vessel floats into the maw the jaw unhinges. So when asked about the Earth itself, it says that Mary sees the gateway die. If you'll remember, the gateway is what Saturn's rings were referred to as in the solar system video. Before then saying that sleeping ones are eaten whole, the vessel floats into the maw, the jaw unhinges. All of these lines imply that this creature, or the iris, consumes entire planets at once, saying that at first Saturn died, and the phrase sleeping ones are eaten whole most likely implies that the entire planet, which is again the vessel that floats, will simply be consumed all at once by this creature when, as it says, the jaw unhinges. What's also really interesting about this is the layout that we see the iris responding in, or the client, is the exact format as the story or children's story that was told in the AI video. Because if you look at the screen as the client is talking, it's in the exact same format as the AI poem, which is why earlier I implied that whatever was being said on screen was not an AI, and instead an actual story of something happening. Regnad then gives the prompt of Moonlight, which is in reference to Moonlight Acres, to which the client says, "New things roam the feeding grounds. The harbinger guards in vain. Mary hears a creaking sound. The hungry eye is welcomed." So when asked about Moonlight Acres, which seems to be a place where the adults, or at least a few of the adults, have made a deal to sacrifice creatures to this entity or entities, it refers to Moonlight Acres as a feeding ground. The line "the harbinger guards in vain" is interesting, as we have a reference to something known as harbinger technology. The line "the harbinger guards in vain" implies that the iris is saying that whatever harbinger technologies does is not going to work. And if you look at the fact that harbinger technologies tries to tell us about the swarms that could be coming in storm safety tips, as well as the sleep image visualizer, it seems that they're trying to help. We then get another reference to Mary with the phrase "Mary hears a creaking sound and the hungry eye is welcomed." We're going to figure out about Mary in just a second, but the hungry eye is welcomed goes back to the camp video in which hungry eyes were trying to be welcomed into these cabins. The final prompt given by Regnad is Jack, to which the computer simply says 4 times in a row, "Jack is with us now," before saying "Jack is us now." And then finally, the episode ends on the message that the client will be in person in about 7 months. So if Jack has been trying to help us this whole time, and now the iris is saying that Jack is with us now, things didn't work out so great for Jack. But we're going to see more details of that with the next story that we're going to talk about right now. In the next episode, Christmas Eve Party, we see Moonlight Acres Christmas Eve Party, which of note is the fact that the video coordinator, Barry Johnson, was one of the vessels that was mentioned in the camp video. Or in other words, Barry Johnson was one of the people who let the hungry eye in. And then very interestingly, we see that our videography was done by Jack and Mary Dean. So not only is that a direct mention of Jack and Mary themselves again, but it also shows us that they were either siblings or more likely married. But if you'll remember, in the original poem mentioned in the 4th episode, it says that Jack jumped over the river and Mary went down it. We're then shown in the video what seems to be a wood crawler attack on a normal Christmas Eve party before a giant amalgamated beast is shown at the door trying to come in. We then hear screaming, which if played backwards, turns from screaming into the phrase, "Jack, it's out here, let me in." In the final shots, we see whatever this beast is breaking in, to which we're shown a blurred out picture of a man named Alex and Jack, and then finally we see that the giant beast was Mary. So it seems like what was happening here was Jack and Mary were trying to escape from these creatures before they were overwhelmed. Jack managed to get away, Mary did not. So now Mary is become a vessel for these creatures, and Jack is being attacked by this vesseled form of her. And this thing is using her distorted voice to try to convince Jack to let her inside. So that goes back to the theory that these roots infect people and then turn them into these giant wood crawler creatures. So while it seems this episode ends rather ambiguously, the fact that we know Mary was a creature, and then in the previous video the iris said Jack is with us now, once again implies that Jack didn't make it. We then have our final video at this point, which is called Home Invasion Help, brought to us by Optica Video, the same people who made games for kids. The video begins by implying that this is a way to survive a home invasion, before you quickly find out that it is the opposite, and it's teaching people how to break into a house. This is done when it talks about breaking a window and how it says it may alert the prey. It also says that prey can be drawn to the door by knocking on it.
VoiceMod is the #1 real-time voice changer for gamers and content creators.
It says one of the best ways to break into a house is to burrow underground and use that to move between nests. Before we get the horrifying line that after you make your way into the house that you should enter prey via the proboscis. So we get more details now from Optica about what these wood crawlers do. They try to find a way to enter into a house rather quietly or draw people out before essentially stabbing them and filling them with these sort of roots. That then allows them to take the people's place and operate essentially as skinwalkers, as seen in the very first video on the channel. We then switch back over to found footage in which we see someone walking through a house that seems to be covered in these red roots, until eventually we start to see people whose entire form is that of roots itself, up until we see someone in a chair who still has an eye, which when the camera is shown at it, the eye moves, indicating that this person is still alive while being consumed by deep root disease. Finally, the cameraman is attacked by something that seems to be a wood crawler, and the transmission goes out. So whenever these wood crawlers attack and fill people with this deep root disease, they become these sort of infected hosts that are slowly turned from the inside out. And it seems that in the end, whoever our cameraman was didn't make it. So that was all of the episodes, and while I talked a lot about what everything could mean, I want to put the final bow tie.
The broadcast programs of this small West Virginia TV show. So without further ado, get uncomfortable and let's get into it. The first program we open with is called You Are on the Fastest Available Route. At the opening of each, or at least most episodes, we see a program guide for the night. This lets us know what time it is and where we're at as a viewer. Here we see that at 12:05 there is a midnight movie, and at 1:55 there is a paid programming. But as it said, the title begins to be deleted. Now this is indication to help us, the audience in the first episode, know that we are watching the paid programming time slot. As it goes on, evidence won't be that clear, but just know that paid programming is a good answer for whatever time we're watching. The broadcast seems to start out fine. Simply the dashcam footage of a man driving through a city. However, it begins to become suspicious when the GPS begins repeating this phrase.
You are on the fastest available route.
It quickly takes him to an abandoned road, completely devoid of any other people or pavement for that matter, as he seems to be driving into the woods. Even more bizarre is the phrase that his GPS says next.
In 300 feet, turn off your headlights.
The driver does this, and even though we do not see what he sees from the noise, it cannot be good. The driver tries to get away, to which the car is destroyed. We see a flame and the broadcast cuts out. So you may be asking yourself, how is this a TV broadcast? What's going on? Why am I watching this YouTube video? And I promise you that from here, all of the above just get worse. So hang on there. The next broadcast we have is called Contingency. We can see from the time slot that it is 3 a.m. as the regular broadcast is ending, to which the screen immediately cuts to a state of emergency warning. This is followed by the national anthem and a message. Now, I want to be clear here. This is my favorite kind of horror. Like what you're about to see, I think is phenomenal, and it's something that you just can't find anywhere. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about Local 58 specifically. Just the ideas and concepts that this brings out. I just want to gush about it. Is really top tier, and it makes me sad that there's not more stuff like this. And the reason I want to put eyes on it is because of how good it is. So if you don't get anything else out of this video, go watch Local 58. It is absolutely worth your time. We see that from the broadcast, America has been defeated by some unspecified force. This is so severe that the broadcast is continuing to tell us to preserve ourselves and our American spirit. While that may not be clear at first, it certainly is made clear shortly thereafter. This goes to the point as giving you specific instructions on how to do it to maintain the victory position and the threat that police will enforce this ruling if you do not carry it out yourself. It continues to broadcast until very harrowingly it says, "None remain to read it." Right before the broadcast cuts, it says that infants and pets are the smallest patriots. This entire thing, absolutely terrifying, but excellent horror. It then seems that Local 58 regains control of the broadcast and says that what we just saw is a hoax. However, immediately after this, a stamp appears that seems to contradict the point that was just made. I also want to say this now. A lot of people think that the Cold War aesthetic and idea of these videos point towards it being in the Cold War, and while they're close, they're not right. For example, we see in the beginning of this broadcast American astronauts planting the flag on the moon, and at the end we see that the message was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. Both things that would be impossible for a late 50s, early 60s timeline. Also, immediately before the message cuts out, we see the phrase, "The 51st state is not a place." And that doesn't mean anything now, but it will later. Also, for my theory to make sense, some things need to be remembered, and one of the most important things to be remembered is the moon. I want you to remember that broadcast opened with Neil Armstrong standing on the moon. That's going to be important in a minute. After this, our next broadcast is called Weather Service. We see in the timestamps next to it that we have Public Eye, Paid Programming, City Council Minutes, and Focus on Faith. Again, as mentioned in the first one, Paid Programming is the most likely candidate for that timestamp we're watching. Weather Service, much like Contingency, opens with an emergency alert, but this time it is a meteorological one. It specifically says, "Do not look at the moon," which is immediately such an odd message for a broadcast station to have, especially in an emergency, but it immediately gets worse. While you may be scratching your head trying to figure out what this means, it goes a 180 and begins to say the opposite. Over and over, if you can read this, "Go outside now," all caps. It seems as if the language and tone has changed a lot from the original message. It's also interesting to point out here, it seems that there is a fight going on within the broadcast itself, as if there's one force saying to go look at the moon, and one force telling you to stay away from windows, stay inside, and do not look up. Judging by the color palette of these messages as they're being displayed, it seems that the force that is telling people to not look at the moon immediately has a change of pace, or at least a revelation, and says this.
Eve to me is basically freedom. It's a giant open universe where
After saying the phrase, "We will look together," the broadcast cuts to this. Now, something else I really want to point out here. I think that agree. For now, I'll just say it is a scream, but it's coming from somewhere else. Up next, we have our shortest broadcast, known as Station ID, which simply says that the station runs on 476 megahertz. That will probably matter in a minute. And we get another message similar to that in Weather Service, where it says, "Look away, it doesn't matter, there are no other receivers," and "Safety in numbers." So yeah, pretty standard fare at this point. Immediately after, we get into the bizarre and perhaps most direct horror in the entire Local 58 series, and that is Show for Children. You see on our timeline that we have Show for Children, and then after that, Community Roundtable, Focus on Culture, and the morning local news. What I think's interesting from a horror perspective is how morning local news seems so far off, but it's so craved as a sense of normalcy as you're kind of in the pit of all of this horrific stuff happening, that even though it's just 2 hours away, it seems like an impossible gap to reach. We then watch a cartoon from another one of Chris Straub's characters known as Cadaver in an episode called A Grave Mistake. Now, as soon as the short begins, you may not notice the moon in the background watching our character walk along and smiling at it in a very creepy manner. It's also made immediately clear that this is not a show for kids. This happens again as Cadaver comes across a creature in a second grave, whose appearance I will get into later. After this, the tone dramatically shifts. Cadaver is absolutely terrified, music drops off, and the moon now holds a look of pure contempt. He then goes into a third grave, which seems to be a tunnel, and as he gets to the end, he finds a fourth grave that he lays himself down in, supposedly to hide. As he waits at the bottom of the grave, this happens. And that's it. That's the end of the cartoon. And what an excellent show for children. Now, it was hard to make out what happened at the end. The moon passed over the grave in the very photorealistic manner and killed Cadaver at the bottom of it. Also, something to note, Cadaver was following the 3F's position mentioned in contingency, lying down facing up, but he died when the moon passed over. Also, we know that the moon is an immediate threat, as it was mentioned in weather service. So far we've established that A, moon is a problem, and B, don't look at it. From that, other logical conclusions aren't hard to put together. That the threat heard in contingency is the moon itself, which makes sense that it would be such a formidable foe that the United States couldn't possibly beat it. So how that gets into you on the fastest available route, we'll get into in a minute. But just for now, understand that possibly is the main threat being faced in these stories. Our next broadcast is called A Look Back, and while it starts out as a retrospective look at Local 58 itself, it immediately switches gears into that of weather service and begins offering cryptic messages. Now, this message about we send signals to their domain is directly related to what we mentioned in station ID when we heard that it was broadcasted at 476 megahertz. What's so special about that? Well, megahertz are the frequency at which waves get launched into space. And when here it is talking about we send signals through their domain, do we really think they wouldn't add their own? It is referring to our broadcast stations. Now, the reason that's significant is because it's saying some of the broadcasts that we're seeing may not be our own. I'll get into a minute why and which ones, but just for now, know that everything is not as it seems. Up next, we have what is undoubtedly the most frightening broadcast in the entire series, Real Sleep. We see that the only possible timestamp is 3 p.m., so therefore that is what we're watching. And we're shown a program from the Thought Research Institute. Now, at the beginning, aside from the very creepy background music, it seems to be a standard fare educational television series that, as you probably guessed at this point, that doesn't last long. It opens with a myth versus facts section, which essentially explains that things are stupid and we shouldn't have them, and they are the effects of a primitive mind. This is very odd as it then leads into something called the effects of a primitive mind. Stupid and we shouldn't have them, and they are the effects of a primitive mind. This is very odd as it then leads into something called the Kleitman map, which is basically just baloney science saying that dreams cause restless sleep and therefore we shouldn't dream. And after that, we get into the section called Introducing Your Anti-Dream, which I'll just play the first part for you. It then does something similar to stage 2, and then into stage 3, it asks you to repeat this phrase to yourself. Before a series of subliminal messages are thrown on screen. And what's absolutely terrifying about these kind of messages is you can't read them aloud or process them vocally, but you can read them and retain them in your brain. And then boom, good night, like it never happened. Now, just a warning if you're planning on watching Real Sleep. It's an absolutely excellent horror short, and I highly recommend it if you like scary stuff. but as someone who followed the steps mentioned in it, I did have nightmares. This is an actual psychological test that's proven to mess with your function and cognition with other people's faces. It is the real deal, and it is pretty freaky. Bombings, go for it. I'm fine for the most part, but and it is function and cognition. If you're planning on watching Real Sleep, it's an absolutely excellent horror short, and I highly recommend it if you like scary stuff. But as someone who followed the steps mentioned in it, I did have nightmares. This is an actual psychological test that's proven to mess with your function and cognition with other people's faces. It is the real deal, and it is pretty freaky. Bombings, go for it. I'm fine for the most part, but just practice caution. A lot of this is really mess with your head type stuff. Excellent horror, but like I said, be careful. And then the broadcast ends with the message, do not see a doctor. Fantastic. After this, we get into our, at this time, final broadcast, and most important for understanding what's going on. And that is called Skywatching. Again, with our beginning timestamps, we see that Skywatching is taking place at midnight, followed by a city council meeting and paid programming. Normally here would be in the paid programming time slot, but since this one is called Skywatching and there's a timestamp for Skywatching, I'm going to say we're watching Skywatching. At first, while the style does transition to amateur, if not a little bit creepy, it seems to be going normal, with the videographer showing Orion's belt and Pleiades as random constellations in the sky. However, this immediately changes when he cuts to the moon. And remember, the moon's kind of a big deal in this series. As he cuts to it, the editor titles it his throne. And as he gets up close on the moon, we see something very, very wrong. It's as if the surface of it has become these fleshy tendrils, and all of the dust on the surface is being drawn into craters, as if the moon itself is breathing or something inside of it is. The camera then pans over and we see a very odd structure. It seems to be several circles or buildings put together that can be seen from Earth that lead to a giant triangle formation in a crater of the moon. Seeing this, the camera pans backwards, we hear an alarm, and then all of a sudden, the moon becomes giant with this diseased side popping out of it and horrible noises being launched as the cameraman walks around the camera, bows down in front of it, and it simply says, rejoice. And that is the ending of Skywatching. And coincidentally, that's the ending at this point for Local 58. So you may be asking yourself, what does it mean? What's going on? What did I just watch? What were those faces? So let's get into it. Now, I also want to go ahead and dispel this point. Everyone, and I mean everyone, who's made videos on this series simply chalks it up to aliens. Everything that happened was aliens, the monsters seen were aliens, yada yada yada. Not only do I think that's incredibly cheap and boring, but I also do not think it is the case. This has gotten to the point where the author himself makes jokes about it on Twitter. What I do think it is the moon itself. Those familiar with the works of H.P. Lovecraft will have heard the ideas of something called an eldritch horror, or eldritch horror. This is essentially just a being that defies the understandings of human logic or the understandings of scope of what a creature can be. Also, I really hate applying one work of art to another work of art, but if I had to compare what I think this creature is to something else, it would be comparable to the brother moons in Dead Space 3. The reason I say that is because I believe the moon in Local 58 is a living, breathing creature that is affecting the actions of things happening on Earth. Or at the very least, something inside of the moon is a living, breathing creature affecting things on Earth. One of the reasons I think it may be a giant beast inside of the moon rather than the moon itself is that whenever the moon is viewed in Skywatching, the videographer refers to it as his throne instead of just, him. Given this, I think that the moon may be a sort of egg, or at least encasement for whatever's inside of it. The chain of events goes something like this. Whenever the US landed on the moon at the end of the space race, those that like to dig a little deeper will know There was 11 minutes of missed time where NASA maintained contact with the crew of Apollo 11, but their transmissions were not made known to the public. There is a lot of theories of what happened in those 11 minutes, but going by Local 58s, I think that they discovered that there was something inside the moon. Again, everything I'm talking is for the ARG and the story. Please do not fill my DMs with, oh, you think there's a giant monster in the moon? Let me have fun, please. Whatever happened on the Apollo 11 mission certainly angered the creature inside of the moon as it began sending messages back to Earth. Those messages were picked up through radio waves, as mentioned in a look back, talking about sending messages into their domain, and it makes sense for them to send their own messages back. This continues until the creature inside of the moon breaks out and has a psychological effect on the people of Earth. So, keeping this whole theory in mind, let's go through each of the individual broadcasts and see how it ties into the bigger picture. Chronologically, we start with who are on the fastest available route. I don't know exactly what to call this creature besides Eldritch Horror or Lovecraftian Beast, so for now I'm just going to refer to it as the moon, but just know it can mean the thing in the moon or whatever. The moon is interacting with signals on Earth, which is what's giving the GPS such a weird direction list for the driver to follow. We know that the moon can influence electronics on Earth as seen by later broadcasts, so saying that it would change the rules on the GPS isn't that far out of the realm of possibility. Not only that, but if it's to be believed that the moon is affecting the psychology of people on Earth, then the driver getting there, hearing these noises, and running away frantically before crashing all makes sense. Next we have contingency, which admittedly is a tricky one. The two prevailing theories are that it is a legitimate emergency put out by the United States, or that it's just a hoax altogether. In my opinion, this is another one of the moon's psychological tricks. If the moon was erupting with a giant Lovecraftian beast to destroy Earth, that would be readily apparent to everyone on Earth. It would make sense to people in the world that their nations would send them a broadcast, essentially surrendering or giving up to this gargantuan creature. However, I think that this is another one of the moon's tricks. It is trying to convince people to commit suicide, but not only that, killing their children and animals en masse as a way to further cause disruption on Earth. This leads into the moon's motives. Is it trying to wipe everyone out? Is it trying to get people to worship it? And I think it's a bit of both. If it can promote hysteria and cause this mass suicide and panic, then people become more reliant on whatever forces that are there. And since it's the only force there, it becomes a god to the people. Again, but it's pretty similar to Dead Space. Remember earlier when I said that the broadcast ended with the 51st state is not a place? There was a period of time after the American moon landing where the moon itself was referred to as the 51st state. I think when given the context that the moon the phrase the 51st state is not a place takes a considerable bit of meaning. It's not a place, it's a This is another reason of why I love this kind of horror so much. It leads to these personal revelations that put everything in a new perspective. Is not a place makes everything tie together. And not only that, but it is absolutely rewarding to figure it out. After that, we get into weather surface, which is our next direct reference to the moon in the series. It says there's a meteorological event, which yes, we've established. The moon is alive, oh no, everyone go hide. However, as I said before, the moon can influence broadcast networks on Earth. So immediately we see this warning change to a coaxing to go outside and look at it. Perhaps looking at the moon or seeing what's going on will either break the psyche of the individual or compel it to worship and just lose its sense of self. Whatever's going on, we can see this fight ensue, as mentioned earlier, where the broadcast station is saying do not go outside and the moon is saying go outside and look at it. In this final phrase, I believe that the moon itself got to the broadcasters, which explains some of the broadcasts we see that come after it. Again, I'll read the quote that the broadcast station says. It's in the light. The moon came in. He found me. Through the mirror, moonlight white, white like eyes, not light, but blood. I drown in him. If you are afraid, we will look together. I also think that this last phrase, if you are afraid we will look together, validates what happens in sky watching. And remember earlier how I said it's not people screaming, it's something else? I think this is the moon screaming. The footage we see at the end of weather service is right before the either hatching or breaking out of the rock for the creature within the moon, which not only ties weather service to sky watching, but it establishes the power of whatever this beast is. After that, we have station ID, which again establishes that there's a megahertz symbol, which means that whatever broadcast we put out can be picked up and transmitted on. And it also says to look away, again referring to the moon, and that there are safety in numbers. This is absolutely referring to the moon itself, to find groups to try to get away. But given the scale of this event, I highly doubt that will stop anything. Next, we have Show for Children. I think that this is once again another one of the moon's ploys, specifically a ploy targeted to kids themselves. We see the moon dreadfully watching our main character as he goes and finds a body, which scares him. Now here's what's really interesting. I didn't pick up on this until like my third watch through of Local 58, but tell me if I'm crazy here. It seems like the creature that Cadaver comes across in the second grave, this thing, looks a whole lot like this thing. I think this may be our one clear glimpse of whatever this thing on the moon is. Obviously scaled down, but this amalgamation of flesh and bone and this awful noises. I could be absolutely crazy. Let me know if I'm crazy, but I think I'm on something with that one, because otherwise that thing on the grave makes absolutely no sense to me. It then ends with Cadaver dreadfully waiting for the moon to pass over, and when it does, Cadaver is killed. Also, we see the corner of the eye of the moon, which may lead some to believe the moon is alive. I believe is to say the moon is watching. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, if the moon is wanting people to die and worship it, then what good is there in promoting fear? And I think it's because children are very responsive to fear as an authority. Like, think about it this way. If you want a kid to worship you as a deity, you're not going to approach it with those ideas of safety and comfort because kids don't understand that. But fear, they will absolutely get into. The same reason children are punished with spanking and things such as, because it is the fear of punishment if they do wrong. So if a child is shown a cartoon character killed by the moon, that immediately establishes a fear and authority in the moon. It's just another strategy to lead to this creature's takeover. In a look back, as mentioned before, it talks about sending signals to their domain and how they can send signals back. Now, real sleep is very interesting given this whole idea of the moon, and I think that it deals much more with the psychological effect of people on Earth. Very obviously, the information in real sleep doesn't make sense.
I want to see the whole world through her eyes.
There's something on your shirt.
Yo!
Kick back, drink a couple beers, watch movies, stuff like that. Like I said, we did, we took like some pain pills here and there on occasion, but then she started like bringing heroin over and stuff like that. And that's, my mom was addicted to methamphetamines when she was, when I was younger, so those hard drugs just kind of scare me a little bit. So that's why I took a step back the first time. I ended up telling her, I was like, hey, for one, I'm dealing with a lot of personal stuff myself right now as it is. I'm a little depressed. But I think we're moving too fast. I think we should, stop talking. And she said, I understand, it's completely fine, no problem, She said, I'll delete your number, I'll never text you again. And that was the last time that we texted. It was probably 2-3 weeks ago.
Okay.
Sometime in July.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things you said was that was the last time that you had contact with her, as far as, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I mean you correct me.
That was the last time that I texted her.
Yeah, text or a phone call or a messenger or anything like that. 2 to 3 weeks ago. Yeah. Okay. And then the last time, when was the last time you saw her?
this is what I was a bit. I didn't tell you the truth when we talked about fish.
Okay.
Lee doesn't know the extent of the evidence, but he knows the investigators have something, and he now has no choice but to amend his alibi to some degree and give some form of admission. This allows the investigators to get one step closer to a confession, while also keeping the capacity of the evidence hidden until a more critical moment.
Last time I saw her was Wednesday afternoon.
Okay.
I heard that she has been basically telling a lot of people at work that we hooked up a bunch, like a couple days before that, and that she was going to like tell about the whole situation, you know, try to get me fired.
Why would that get you fired?
I'm a manager and she's an employee. So
okay, so you guys aren't supposed to fraternize?
Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
And she just told people, I guess, that she was out with that work at the restaurant that we were having sex.
Okay.
I pulled in the parking lot. She pulled in a little bit after me. I parked and I said, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" And she said, "Yeah, what's up?" And I was like, "I heard you've been saying some things about me and you continuing to hang out, and you know that we're boyfriend and girlfriend." And she asked me, she said, "Can I come sit in the car? Because I just did some heroin and I'm a little paranoid."
Heroin doesn't make you feel paranoid. It makes you extremely relaxed and oblivious to your surroundings. Some might argue that heroin can cause paranoia depending on the user, yet Savannah was driving moments earlier and was about to start a shift at work. If she was using, she most certainly wasn't the type to get paranoid.
Okay. I said, "Why are you doing that? You know, you're doing really well. You shouldn't have been doing that." Okay. And so she came and sat in the car, and I explained to her the situation. I told her that servers at Bonefish were telling me that you're telling people when you're out that we're still having sex and I'm working with your girlfriend. And I said, I would appreciate, I need you to stop, because for one, it's jeopardizing my job. We agreed to, split, stop talking mutually and just move on and, be cordial or whatever. But it was nothing more than that. And she said, "Fuck you, you're a piece of shit." And I said, she said she's gonna keep talking, telling lies and stuff about me and everything like that. And at that point,
Lee has just tried to cover his tracks as much as possible without giving away anything incriminating. He may have thought a witness saw him at the scene with Savannah and was most likely hoping the verbal argument was the extent of what was seen. He therefore gives away this detail in an attempt to come across as truthful. Yet as we know, the investigators have proof that Savannah never got out of the car, and he's about to lock himself into his second lie, which is exactly what the detectives want.
She had her phone in her hand, she got out of the car and walked towards the main entrance from San Jose.
So like if
so this is
like
I wouldn't say she was walking along the edge of the plaza, but she was walking maybe towards this way. And I would say an older model Ford pickup, green.
Okay.
Drove past me and around, and she got in.
Okay.
The suspect has now thrown away his best possible defense, which would have been that he drove away from the parking lot with Savannah, and that she got out at another destination where they then parted ways. If he had known about the surveillance footage, this would have no doubt been his revised narrative, but it's no longer possible due to this fabrication. This is now his stated alibi under caution, and any amendments that he might try to make at a later stage will have no credibility whatsoever.
So she gets out of the backseat and begins walking in the direction of, not necessarily paralleling San Jose, but she's walking towards 295 or down towards that entrance area.
Yeah.
And then she's got her phone, and you said you thought she was calling somebody?
The detective knows this alibi is completely fabricated, so you might be wondering why he's inquiring into it further. The truth is that he's not actually inquiring, only pretending to. The suspect's responses to these questions are of no importance, and the detective is not information gathering. He's simply getting the suspect to let his guard down as much as possible by making him think that he is being believed. As the suspect continues to to convey this made-up narrative, his anxiety will slowly diminish, his belief that he is fooling the detectives will increase, and his heightened state of mind will decrease as a result. This is a well-known strategy, and the reason for this strategy is because the detective is about, and Rodardi appears to be considerably more at ease.
295 all the way to Beach Boulevard to Grove Park, and then Grove Park.
How long does that usually take you? Depending on traffic, obviously.
I think it usually takes me about 25 minutes or so.
Okay. What happened to your neck?
We see a very sharp and very sudden switch. The suspect is taken from feeling assured to once again feeling threatened. It's believed that when the immediate shift from one emotion to the next is so extreme, a suspect can become disoriented, and their ability to think critically can be affected. In other words, it's much harder for them to think up lies on the spot or fabricate emotion in a convincing manner.
That was self-inflicted, actually.